Hi there. Jim Scriven here, Education Executive and NLSA Commissioner for the Northwest District. And I have the pleasure of speaking with you today for this validation team training in regards to Standard 2 of evidence based accreditation relationships. This is a highly significant standard area because, after all, relationships are everything. For this standard, validation team members are reviewing indicator ratings and evidence related to three subsections: 2A, school and congregation; 2B, school and community; and 2C, school climate. Each of these subsections are structured in the self study like a standard unto its own, with initial narrative required responses, required evidence, required indicators of success, general indicators of success, and summary and response actions sections. And then at the end of 2C in the self study, there is a final additional rating grid where the school totals up its standard 2 overall rating. That final overall rating is the score that the validation team will use to compare its team rating against as you complete the validation team report. Speaking to that validation team report, even though Standard 2 is broken into those three clearly defined sections in the self study, they're all merged for the team report. When you are asked to validate the required indicators and required evidence, you are addressing all three subsections in one location of your report. Likewise, your validation remarks and ratings for 2A, 2B, and 2C flow from one to the next to the last, all in one combined rating grid. Very convenient. With this difference between the self-study format and the validation team report format, it becomes critical that you answer the final questions at the end of Standard 2 in your team report, keeping all three sections in mind. As you speak to any changes in ratings you have made, strengths you are validating, or concerns you are validating, be specific in identifying the correct reference indicator. You would not want to refer to 203, for example, but would refer to 2A03, 2B03, or 2C03, avoiding confusion. Please remember that one of your primary mandates as a validation team is to seek to validate what the school has said about itself. Be diligent and tireless in the pursuit of evidence to confirm their self study. We're cheering for them. We want to validate that their required indicators and evidence have been proven through evidence just like they believe they have done. We want to see and prove that sufficient evidence exists to support the level of implementation the school claims for each general indicator. In this form of the self-study instrument, remember that a rating of 3 indicates all operational benchmarks are present and confirmed through multiple sources of evidence. The highest standard is to confirm each operational benchmark through at least 2 of 3 types of evidence. Those 3 categories of evidence being written documentation, observation, and interviews. If they've provided written evidence that supports something as true, can you affirm it through talking with people when you're on site? That's an interview. Or were you able to observe practices that match up with what the written documentation says? And keep in mind, the NLSA survey responses that they will have collected and aggregated, those count as another source of evidence. Whenever you've confirmed 2 different categories of evidence for an operational benchmark, that is sufficient validation. That said, the validation team may accept only one category of evidence as sufficient if the evidence is still clearly abundant. But due diligence will demonstrate you can usually easily validate by 2 different methods simply by asking enough questions. You can find the support for what you have observed or what they have written in such a way. The whole point of clarifying the evidence categories is so that you may effectively document the sources of evidence next to each operational benchmark in your validation team report. Aligning evidence with each bullet point very clearly in your document allows you to see if any benchmarks are being missed. They really stand out that way. This is how you then determine your team rating. If sufficient evidence exists for all operational benchmarks of a general indicator, every bullet point, you may give that a 3 operational. If at least half of those bullet points, those benchmarks, are supported by evidence, then they get a 2, emerging. If less than half of the benchmarks are met, the rating is 1, not evident. I know, they may have some. It still counts as not evident and should be considered a major deficiency in your validation team report unless the team collectively believes there are extenuating circumstances that justify allowing that 1 to simply be addressed in the action plan like any other concern. But be prepared to be questioned on that. The validation team may validate a 4 or increase the school's rating to a 4 in the way the validation team sees it if it believes the evidence clearly and abundantly demonstrates the indicator is fulfilled in a manner that far exceeds expectations. Not fully met, not done really well, but knocks it completely out of the park. Use 4s sparingly. There are a number of indicators that commonly trip our schools up, which validation teams should be specifically on the look for here in Standard 2. These would be 2B01, a required indicator that says the statement of non-discrimination must be evident in school printed materials. That word was plural. It is not enough to have it only printed in one location. Confirm that it can be found in at least 2 school printed documents. One printed document on the website is not enough. At least 2 school printed documents meets this indicator. Also be sure that it is specific in noting students are admitted without regard to race, color, or national origin. Some schools get confused here, thinking the government requires that creed, faith, or religion must also be in that list. That's not true. There's actually freedom of religion in our country, so that statement would be false. We may make enrollment decisions based upon matters of faith, but a school should strive to be consistent in how they do so. A school discipline code is under the required evidence for Standard 2. This refers to a school-wide discipline code. Now, it does not specify what that looks like, but there must be something in place and clearly stated regarding how the school's expectation school-wide is in place for student discipline. Leaving it up to every teacher like the Wild Wild West does not sufficiently meet this evidence expectation. They've got to say something somewhere in the school's overall discipline expectations. Some schools seek a pass on 2A02 and 2A03 for one of 2 reasons. Be aware of this. Either church leadership and or pastoral leadership is not giving any attention or support to the school ministry, despite requests and invitations from school leadership. So the school's saying it's not our fault. Or the school is an independent, recognized service organization rather than being owned and operated by one or more congregations. Now, that first reason, the church leadership, pastor, or leadership not being really engaged, gets no love from us, despite feeling empathy for a school that may be experiencing such a circumstance. The evidence will be lacking for these indicators. The congregation's pastors, and church leadership, they need to play their roles effectively in the life of the school ministry for the school to maximize its mission. So if it's not happening, we need to highlight that through the accreditation process. It should definitely show up in your validation team report. Now, regarding independent RSOs, it's true. They may not have a congregation that directly supports and contributes to the ministry of the school. There may not be a pastor attached directly to this school. That just makes it more difficult to meet these indicators, but it's not impossible. However, every situation is unique, so validation teams should review the situation and determine whether or not it is appropriate to allow a lack in one of these indicators to remain unaddressed by the action plan. It doesn't mean your report says there's no issue here. It's just whether or not it needs to be addressed in the action plan. That's partly up to you. 2B02 speaks to the school's student population reflecting the ethnic, racial, and economic diversity of its community. Sadly, many of our schools fall short on this one. Be on the lookout for excuses and justifications that schools may try to use in lieu of evidence claiming they meet this indicator as well as possible. Be ready to challenge them to improve in this area, seeking genuine strategies that can go into their action plan to grow their student body to better match the community they serve. 2B03 addresses the community involvement of both students and staff. Don't fail to miss that one of the three operational benchmarks identifies that staff members are engaged in community service. This refers to community service independent of the students. Teachers performing community service as part of a class field trip with their students, that's not enough. However, it is not required that all staff members are independently engaged in community service, just some. And it's perfectly fine if they do so collectively, such as a group of faculty and staff volunteering together at a local soup kitchen. That works. 2B04 speaks to having an active parent-teacher organization and/or other parent support groups. It is not necessary for a school to have a traditional parent-teacher organization anymore, but they must in some manner bring parents together still and empower them to act in support and on behalf of the good of the school, building community, and strengthening the connection of parents to the school and each other. In such a way, they are helping parents advance the school towards its mission and goals. Some schools have decided they no longer operate a PTO. Times have changed. Parents just aren't interested or don't have the time. They don't get a pass on this indicator, but rather they have to determine other means to achieve the same results through some sort of parent support groups. Finally, as you work through the indicators of 2C, school climate, pay careful attention to all the operational benchmarks. Schools sometimes fall into the trap of knowing how warm and loving their school climate is and believing that Christ is truly felt and integrated into all things. That very confidence misleads them, and they fail to provide sufficient measurable evidence to prove they're meeting these indicators. Follow the evidence. Perhaps more than any other part of Standard C, this is where you cannot settle for accepting only interviews, what people say about this school they love. You need different kinds of evidence to go with. They've got to back each benchmark up with what you can observe or written documentation along with what they say about the school. I find 2C is an area validation teams commonly end up reducing ratings as compared to what the school said about itself. Thank you again for your preparation for service on an NLSA validation team. I hope you enjoy and value this opportunity to help school ministries enhance their efforts and effectiveness in the area of relationships. God's blessings to you on your service.